Exploring innovation space. Now we've seen that innovation involves a journey moving from ideas to create value from those ideas. But which ideas? And how long should the journey be? And in which direction? These are questions we're going to explore in this film. Basically, we're also going to look at some tools to help us manage the journey. And we're going to focus on three core concepts. The distance, how far we should travel, the idea of how much the innovation is incremental or radical in terms of its novelty, the direction, which way could we innovate, and the level that we're innovating in. So let's start with the first of these concepts, the idea of innovation distance, in terms of how novel, how much novelty are we dealing with? Innovation's about change, but how much change? And one of the concepts important here is the idea of incremental innovation. This is essentially doing what we do a little bit better. So it might be a line extension or an improvement in a product or optimizing a process. It's little improvements, doing what we do better. And these have a number of advantages. First of all, they build on what we already know. So we're not working with the unknown, the unfamiliar, with high uncertainty. We do have a lot of knowledge. We're just incrementally moving forward. So the risk is a lot lower. And the benefit of this is we therefore can probably implement this fairly successfully. So there's a lot of good reasons why we would want to do incremental innovation. It's relatively easy to manage. The downside is, of course, that these small steps have relatively low impact. Taken on their own, they're only very small steps forward. And that sets us up for trouble if we keep on moving forward just doing what we do a bit better and somebody else makes a big leapfrog, we could be in trouble. So there are advantages, but also disadvantages to only doing incremental innovation. Let's look at some examples of incremental innovation and the impact that it has. Now, as I say, Thomas Edison, one of the great innovators of all time, created amongst many other products the electric light bulb. But the first one he created didn't work particularly well, was extremely expensive and of dubious quality. What happened after that initial innovation was a gradual process of incremental innovation. Over years, over decades, but basically the price fell and the performance rose. Now that wasn't just an isolated example. Henry Ford's Model T, much the same. The first Model T was okay, but quite expensive relative to the price as it came down over many, many subsequent years. At the same time, the Model T got better, more reliable, better quality. The productivity in the factory improved. Once again, the same pattern of adding up incremental steps, doing what we do better, over time has an impact. But it's not just back in history. If we look at something like solar panels, hugely important these days, making a really important contribution to energy, but basically the early solar panels were very expensive and not particularly reliable or high performance. But once again, over time, the price has gone down and the performance has gone up. Not by magic, because of sustained incremental innovation, doing what we do better. Now, the other type of innovation we ought to talk about is radical innovation. This is essentially innovation where we're doing something completely different, perhaps something we've never done before. That's very different from doing what we do better. This is about a big step forward, a big leap, and it may well involve a radical improvement in terms of some dimension of performance, or some dramatic reduction in the costs. So it's the kind of innovation which has the advantage of step change and also the advantage sometimes of changing the game. So a lot of things that create new industries, a lot of things that give small businesses, small startups a real opportunity involve radical innovation. However, there are also some disadvantages. First of all, it's uncertain. We don't know, the world has perhaps never seen this before, so the risks are very high. And as a result, it's not necessarily easy to implement radical innovations. And they're going to need to have a lot of learning. We need new knowledge to drive such innovation. This isn't building on what we know, this is creating new knowledge. So once again, this pattern of big advantages, but also some challenges if we're serious about managing radical innovation, doing something different. A good place to start, the computer. Now, these days, everyone has a computer, but in the very early days of computing, this was a revolution, a radical change in the way we did calculations, the way we managed information. Radical innovation, which gave a step change in performance. The early days were tricky, it was very uncertain, a lot of learning, new knowledge, but gradually this became an established innovation, not least through a lot of incremental innovation to help make it work. Or the telephone. Again, a revolution in the way we communicate with each other. Previous to Alexander Bell's invention, what we had was the telegraph. We could communicate electronically, but essentially with a code, Morse code or something similar. What Alexander Bell gave us was the ability to speak and hear. A revolution, one which is continuing today, one which has brought step changes in performance. But again, this wasn't an overnight success. Making radical innovation happen involves a great deal of learning. And we talked about Thomas Edison and his light bulb. Now, in his day, the light bulb was a rather crude device. It basically was a wire that was heated up inside a glass bubble. And the light really only came as a byproduct to heating up the wire. So it's not necessarily the most efficient thing to do, and it certainly used a lot of energy. These days we have another revolution in lighting, which is called LED, light-emitting diodes. It's a different piece of physics. It's basically solid-state electronics, uses a fraction of the electricity, but allows us to do a great deal more with it. LED lighting is incredibly versatile, and we're still at the beginning of learning how to use it. So we have another example there of a radical innovation, something the world hadn't seen before, something which has brought a step change in performance. Now, if you think about it, startups very often involve radical innovation. It's in their nature. What you're trying to do as a startup entrepreneur is to see something that no one else has seen, seize an opportunity and take that forward. Let's look at some examples. If you think about the music industry, there's been lots and lots of innovation in there, some radical, a lot of incremental. Go right back to our good friend Thomas Edison. One of his many, many innovations was the gramophone. In the early days, sound was recorded onto wax cylinders, later on wax discs. They then became vinyl, and later still we moved from vinyl records into the world of compact cassettes, and from there to CDs. And then we had that fascinating time when we had digital music. And then Apple came into the game with quite a powerful innovation around iTunes. Lots of innovation going on, but interestingly, a couple of entrepreneurs in Sweden found themselves asking an interesting question. Why do we need to own the music? Which is how we came to have streaming services like Spotify. Because essentially what's going on there is the quite radical thought, maybe people want the music, not necessarily the ownership of that music. Or let's take another example, the computer industry. Now, we saw that IBM and many other players were dominant in that industry back in the 1960s. But at that time, it was very much an industry built on computing for business. IBM's name, International Business Machines. So we were talking about big computers, mainframes. Even when they started calling them mini computers, they were still huge things. Until a couple of guys over in California asked another interesting question. Who isn't using a computer yet, but might? And what came from that question, of course, was the idea of the home computer. Why not grow an entirely new market from zero and actually get people involved in using computers for all sorts of day-to-day activities around the home, around small businesses? Another revolution basically built on a radical innovation triggered by a startup, or in that case, several startups like Apple Computers. Let's take one more example, this time from the world of domestic appliances. specifically the vacuum cleaner. Now, this device, invented quite a while back, became a staple in almost every household. The electric vacuum suction sweeper. And all sorts of people use them in their different forms, essentially the product of innovation, mostly of the incremental variety, doing what we do a little better. Until a certain gentleman in England asked another interesting question. Why won't this wretched thing work? His name was James Dyson, and the reason he was so angry in asking his question was frustration. He was trying to clean up, and the vacuum cleaner wasn't sucking up. And he, being an engineer, decided in the end he'd have to investigate. So he took it apart, and on his workbench he looked at it and found that the bag itself, which is the key part, was so clogged up with dirt and dust it wasn't giving any suction anymore. Then he had an insight. Why do we need the bag? Now, it wasn't an instant success. It took him actually 5 years and over 5,000 prototypes, but eventually he developed the bagless vacuum cleaner. And that was the basis of a very successful stream of product innovations which today have come to dominate a billion-dollar business in the world of domestic appliances. Another startup triggered by radical innovation. So one other thing we ought to look at are the overall patterns of innovation that we can see. Because it's not really a question of incremental or radical, they both matter and they work together. Incremental innovation on its own is about doing what we do better, about small steps, but they add up. If we take something like quality, quality is something which we hardly notice the innovation because so much of that is around continuous improvement. But in the old days, the bad old days, we used to talk about percentage defects. That is to say, of a product, we might assume in 100 versions of those produced, maybe somewhere, some number would be defects. These days, we talk in parts per million. Whether it's microchips or motor cars, essentially the level of quality has gone up and up and up. Not through one radical quality innovation, but through continuous incremental innovation. But even if we take radical innovation, which gives us a step change, that takes an awful lot of incremental innovation to make it work. So let's try and summarize where we've been in this film. We've basically said that innovation can involve change, and there are different degrees of novelty to that change. And we can think about this as the distance we might travel on our innovation journey. Some of them will be local trips, familiar, essentially doing what we do but better, incremental innovation. But some of them might be big leaps into the unknown, radical innovation. It's not an either-or, but a spectrum, different novelty along a spectrum. But the further you go, if we go back to our distance metaphor, the higher the risk. Now, let's pause for a moment and think about all of that.